The dawn came as it always did, cruel, indifferent, and absolute. Cale had learned long ago that sunrise was not the gentle awakening the poets spoke of in their gilded halls. It was not the soft kiss of light upon grateful earth, nor the tender mercy that painted the world in hues of gold and rose. No. Dawn was a blade. Sharp, merciless, and unforgiving. It carved through shadow with the certainty of an executioner's stroke, leaving no sanctuary for those who dwelled in darkness. He had not expected to die today. That thought seemed almost laughable now, as he lay sprawled across the scorched stone floor of a collapsing cave, his legs twisted beneath him at angles that made his stomach heave with nausea and his vision blur with tears he refused to shed. The pain was extraordinary, a symphony of agony that sang through every nerve ending, every shattered bone, every torn muscle. It was the kind of pain that redefined existence itself, that made every breath a negotiation with consciousness, every heartbeat a small victory against the encroaching darkness at the edges of his vision. But it was the girl who held his attention now. She lay mere inches from him, her body partially shielded by a fragment of collapsed stone that had once formed the cave's entrance. Her skin was pale, not the pallor of illness or fear, but something more profound. Luminescent. Like moonlight given flesh. Like pearl carved from the deepest ocean and brought to the surface world where it did not belong. Her hair cascaded around her in waves of midnight silk, tangled with dust and debris, yet somehow still maintaining an otherworldly elegance that seemed to mock their desperate circumstances. But it was her wings that truly captured the eye. Even in their current state, torn, bleeding, folded protectively around her torso, they were magnificent. Vast membranes of translucent flesh stretched between elegant bone structures that resembled the fingers of some ancient, delicate hand. They bore scars, these wings. Old wounds that had healed into patterns that looked almost deliberate, as if pain itself had become artistry across their surface. They trembled with each shallow breath she took, sending small clouds of dust spiraling into the harsh morning light that was steadily, inevitably, creeping toward them both. Cale had dragged her here. Through fire. Through falling stone. Through the screaming chaos of a collapsing underground sanctuary that had been breached by those who called themselves holy warriors. He had grabbed her, this creature, this vampire, and pulled her toward what he had hoped would be safety, even as the weight of her unconscious form and the treacherous terrain had conspired to destroy him. He remembered the exact moment his legs had given out. The sickening crack of bone that had sounded impossibly loud even amidst the roar of destruction. The way his body had simply stopped obeying him, as if someone had severed the strings that connected intention to action. He had fallen, still clutching her, and they had tumbled together into this cave, this tomb, perhaps, as the entrance had partially collapsed behind them. That had been hours ago. Or perhaps minutes. Time had become elastic, unreliable, measured only by the slow march of sunlight across the cave floor and the gradual fading of his own strength. The light was getting closer now. It crept across the ground like a living thing, golden and terrible, reaching for her with fingers of illumination that promised nothing but death. Cale had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. Vampires and sunlight did not coexist. The day was poison to them, a slow burning that consumed flesh and bone alike until nothing remained but ash and the fading echo of what had once been. He should leave her. That was the rational thought that kept surfacing through the haze of pain. He should drag himself, crawl if necessary, deeper into the cave, away from the sunlight that threatened them both, away from this doomed creature whose very nature marked her as an enemy to all living things. His people and her kind had been at war for centuries. The blood debt between humans and vampires was written in volumes that stretched back through generations, each page stained with atrocity and counter-atrocity until the original grievance was lost in an ocean of mutual hatred. But he didn't move. Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps it was the knowledge that he likely wouldn't survive anyway, that his crushed legs and the blood he could feel pooling beneath him had already written his ending. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that troubled him most, it was something else entirely. Something about the way she had looked at him in that single moment before the collapse, when their eyes had met amidst the chaos and he had seen not the monster he expected, but something achingly, terrifyingly human. Fear. She had been afraid. The sunlight crept closer. 6 feet away now. Then 5. Cale's hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching out to grasp a large piece of torn cloth, once part of some tapestry that had adorned the underground sanctuary's walls, now reduced to debris. His fingers closed around it, and with strength he didn't know he still possessed, he dragged it over her prone form, creating a barrier between her pale skin and the approaching light. It wasn't enough. He could already see the edges of the cloth beginning to smolder where the sunlight touched it. The fabric was too thin, too porous. The light would burn through it in minutes, perhaps less, and then there would be nothing between her and the dawn. His mind raced through possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. He could try to move her again, drag her deeper into the cave, but one look at his own ruined legs told him that was impossible. He could try to build a better shelter, stack stones to create shade, but his strength was fading with each passing moment, and the morning light was relentless, patient, inevitable. The cloth caught fire. Small flames licked at its edges, sending up thin spirals of smoke that stung Cale's eyes and throat. He batted at them frantically, only succeeding in spreading the fire faster. The girl, the vampire, stirred slightly, a small sound escaping her lips. It might have been pain. It might have been the beginning of wakefulness. Either way, it meant she was still alive, still capable of sensation, still something that could suffer. That was when Cale made his decision. He didn't think about it. Thinking would have meant acknowledging the absolute insanity of what he was about to do. Instead, he simply acted, moving with the kind of desperate clarity that comes only in moments when all other options have been exhausted and all that remains is the terrible freedom of having nothing left to lose. Using his arms, ignoring the screaming protest of his shattered legs, Cale dragged himself over her body. He positioned himself between her and the sunlight, spreading his arms wide, making himself into a living shield. The morning light hit his back immediately, warm, pleasant, the kind of sunshine that might have felt beautiful under any other circumstances. But he knew what it would mean for her if even a single ray slipped past him. He pressed himself down, covering as much of her as he could, tucking his body around hers in a posture that was part embrace, part fortress. The pain from his legs was nothing compared to the effort of holding this position. Every muscle in his arms and back screamed. His vision swam with dark spots that threatened to coalesce into unconsciousness. He could feel her beneath him now, the cool touch of her skin even through his clothes, the slight rise and fall of her breathing, the way her wings shifted and trembled as if seeking escape from this crushing weight. She would wake soon. He could sense it somehow, the way one senses a coming storm before the first drops fall. And when she woke, she would find herself trapped beneath a human, weak and vulnerable, in a scenario that would likely trigger every predatory instinct her kind possessed. She would probably kill him. If his injuries didn't claim him first, her fangs certainly would. But at least she would be alive to do it. The thought brought a strange smile to Cale's lips, though whether it was humor or simply delirium, he couldn't say. Here he was, dying to save the life of a vampire, a creature his people had fought and feared for generations. His father would have called him a traitor. His mother would have wept. His fellow soldiers would have spat on his memory. And yet, somehow, in this moment, with the sunlight warm on his back and the cool presence of this impossible creature beneath him, Cale felt more certain of this choice than he had felt about anything in his entire life. He didn't know her name. Didn't know her story. Didn't know if she was young or old by her kind's reckoning, if she had family waiting for her somewhere in the darkness, if she had ever loved or been loved, if she had committed atrocities or simply been trying to survive in a world that wanted her dead. None of it mattered. She was alive, and he could keep her that way, and that would have to be enough. The darkness at the edges of his vision grew darker. His breathing became labored, each inhalation requiring conscious effort. He could feel his grip on consciousness loosening, could feel himself beginning to slip away into that vast unknown that waited for all mortal things. But he held on. He held position. He held the line between her and the light that would destroy her. And as the morning grew brighter and the cave grew warmer, Cale found himself whispering words he didn't fully understand, words that might have been prayer or confession or simply the fevered rambling of a dying man. "Stay alive," he murmured, his voice barely audible even to himself. Just stay alive. He didn't know if she could hear him. Didn't know if some part of her unconscious mind registered his words or his sacrifice. But he said them anyway, again and again, a mantra against the encroaching darkness, a promise made to a creature who had no reason to trust him and every reason to kill him. And then, finally, mercifully, the darkness claimed him entirely, and Cale knew nothing more. The world returned to her in fragments. Consciousness was not a single moment of awakening but a gradual assembly of sensations, each one slightly wrong, slightly displaced, like a puzzle being put together by someone who had lost the reference image. There was pain, certainly, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. But more than pain, there was confusion, disorientation, the sense that something fundamental about reality had shifted while she slept, leaving her stranded in a world that no longer followed the rules she understood. Wait. That was the first specific sensation she could identify. Something heavy pressed against her, warm and solid, radiating heat in a way that felt both comforting and deeply alarming. Her kind did not generate warmth like this. Her people were creatures of the cold spaces between stars, their bodies maintaining the temperature of the grave, the crypt, the eternal night. This heat was foreign, unsettling, living. Her eyes opened slowly, reluctantly, as if some part of her mind wanted to remain in the safety of unconsciousness rather than face whatever strange new reality awaited. The first thing she saw was stone, rough, gray, uneven. A cave ceiling, she realized, though not one she recognized. The light was wrong too. Filtered. Indirect. It came from somewhere to her left, though she couldn't turn her head far enough to see the source. Something prevented her movement, held her pinned. The weight shifted slightly, and with that movement came a sound. Breathing. Ragged, shallow, labored. Someone else's breathing. Memory crashed back into her with sudden, violent force. The sanctuary. The attack. Holy warriors pouring through passages that were supposed to be secret, waving blessed blades that burned at the touch, shouting prayers that felt like acid against her skin. The chaos of her people trying to flee, trying to fight, trying to survive an onslaught that had come without warning and without mercy. She had been trying to reach the deeper chambers, the ancient places where even blessed weapons lost their power, when something had struck her from behind. The world had gone white with pain, and then nothing. Until now. She tried to move and found herself restricted. Not bound, exactly, but trapped beneath whoever, was lying on top of her. Panic flared in her chest, hot and immediate, triggering instincts that were older than memory, older than thought. Her body responded before her mind could catch up, muscles tensing, preparing to throw off this threat with the supernatural strength that was her birthright. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the complete vulnerability of the position. Whatever lay atop her was not restraining her with force or malice. The weight was passive, protective even, spread across her in a way that suggested shelter rather than imprisonment. Or perhaps it was the breathing, those harsh, painful gasps that spoke of injury and suffering, of someone clinging to consciousness by will alone. Or perhaps it was simply the heat. That impossible, wonderful, terrible warmth. She forced herself to be still, to think rather than react. Slowly, carefully, she turned her head as far as the restricting weight would allow, trying to see what held her. An arm came into view first, human, unmistakably so, with the olive-toned skin and lean muscle of someone accustomed to physical labor. The arm was positioned across her torso, one hand splayed protectively over her shoulder, fingers curled slightly inward as if maintaining a grip even in unconsciousness. A human was lying on top of her, shielding her body with his own. The realization sent a cascade of conflicting emotions through her. Confusion dominated, followed closely by suspicion and a strange, uncomfortable gratitude that she immediately tried to suppress. Humans and vampires did not protect each other. They killed each other. They had been killing each other for so long that the original reasons for the war had been lost to time, preserved only in legends that had grown too tall to be entirely true. Yet here was this impossible reality, a human using his own body to keep her safe from something. But what? She shifted slightly, testing the limits of her movement, and felt the change in light immediately. There was sunlight nearby. She could sense it the way one senses a fire in an adjoining room, not by seeing it directly, but by feeling its heat, its presence, the threat it represented. Her kind sensitivity to daylight was not mere vulnerability. It was a visceral, instinctive recognition of their oldest enemy, the force that had driven them into shadows and deep places since time immemorial. Understanding dawned with the weight of revelation. He was shielding her from the sun. This human, this stranger whose name she didn't know, whose face she hadn't seen, had placed himself between her and the daylight that would burn her to ash. Was still maintaining that position even now, though she could feel the tremors running through his body, the irregular cadence of his breathing that suggested he was barely clinging to life. Why? The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, a whisper that seemed too loud in the enclosed space of the cave. Why would you? She didn't finish the question. Couldn't finish it. The implications were too vast, too impossible to articulate. Instead, she carefully, slowly shifted her weight, trying to slide out from beneath him without disturbing his position too much or exposing herself to whatever sunlight he was protecting her from. It was harder than she expected. His body, though clearly injured, had settled into a configuration that maximized coverage, minimizing any gaps through which light might reach her. She found herself appreciating the geometry of it even as she struggled to extricate herself. The way his arms were positioned, the angle of his torso, the deliberate spread of his legs despite what she could now see was catastrophic damage to both limbs. Her medical training, rudimentary by her people's standards but still more advanced than most humans possessed, catalogued the injuries automatically. Both legs crushed below the knee. Multiple compound fractures. Massive internal bleeding indicated by the distension of his lower abdomen and the pallor of his skin. Shock, clearly, kept at bay only by what must have been an extraordinary act of will. This human should be dead. By all reasonable medical standards, he should have succumbed to his injuries hours ago. But he had held on, had kept himself conscious and positioned and protective long enough for her to survive the daylight that would have killed her. The gratitude she felt was almost painful in its intensity, made worse by the knowledge that gratitude was perhaps the least appropriate emotion for the situation. Her people were dying, killed by his people, in a conflict that showed no signs of ending. For all she knew, this human had participated in the attack that had nearly destroyed her sanctuary. He might have been one of the holy warriors, separated from his unit, injured in the fighting, who had only helped her by accident or because his injured state had left him with no other choice. But even as these cynical thoughts formed, she found them impossible to truly believe. The position of his body was too deliberate. The protection too complete. This had been a choice, conscious and maintained despite enormous cost. She finally managed to pull herself free, sliding backward into the deeper shadows of the cave while carefully keeping her wings folded to avoid the sunlight that streamed through the partial opening of the cave entrance. Once clear, she turned to look at him properly for the first time, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. He was young. Younger than she had expected. Perhaps 20 summers, give or take, with a kind of lean, weathered look that came from a hard life lived under open skies. His hair was dark, cropped short in a military style, now matted with blood and dust. His face, turned slightly to the side, bore the fine bone structure of good breeding mixed with the hard edges of extensive combat training. There were scars, small ones, mostly, the kind that came from years of practice with weapons and the occasional real engagement. But it was his expression that caught her attention most. Even in unconsciousness, even racked with pain that must have been extraordinary, his face held a quality of determination that bordered on stubbornness. His jaw was set, his brow slightly furrowed, as if he was arguing with death itself and refusing to accept defeat. She found herself reaching toward him before consciously deciding to move, her hand hovering over his shoulder, uncertain whether to touch him or leave him be. Contact with humans was forbidden by her people's laws except in specific circumstances. Feeding, combat, or diplomatic necessity. Personal touch, touch motivated by compassion or curiosity, was strictly prohibited, considered dangerous both practically and philosophically. But laws seemed very distant in this moment, in this cave, with this dying human who had saved her life for no reason she could understand. Her hand descended, coming to rest gently on his shoulder. His skin was hot beneath her palm, fever-warm, life-warm, so different from the cool flesh of her own people that it felt like touching fire. She could feel his heartbeat through the contact, irregular, weakening, but still fighting. Still persisting. "You fool," she whispered, and was disturbed by the emotion that cracked her voice. "You beautiful, idiotic fool." She needed to do something. Needed to help him somehow. But what? Her medical knowledge was extensive when it came to her own people's physiology, but humans were different. Their bodies operated on principles that seemed both simpler and vastly more complicated than her kind's biological architecture. They were fragile and resilient in equal measure, capable of surviving injuries that should by all logic be fatal while simultaneously dying from wounds that seemed trivial. More urgently, she needed information. Needed to understand what had happened, where she was, whether more of his kind were nearby ready to finish what they had started. Needed to know if any of her people had survived, if there was still a sanctuary to return to, if the attack had been an isolated incident or the opening move in a larger campaign. But to get answers, she would need him conscious. And for him to be conscious, he would need medical care that she wasn't certain she could provide. Her gaze drifted to his neck, and immediately she forced her eyes away, shame coloring her thoughts. The hunger was always there, of course, a constant companion for her kind, as natural and necessary as breathing was for humans. But it had been growing worse over the past hours, exacerbated by her injuries and the energy she had expended in unconscious healing while she slept. The scent of his blood was almost overwhelming this close, rich and vital, and calling to instincts that she had been trained since childhood to control. Feeding on him would help, would restore her strength, accelerate her healing, give her the energy she needed to potentially save both their lives. Her saliva carried coagulant properties that could help stabilize his injuries if applied properly. There were even compounds in vampire saliva that could serve as powerful analgesics, dulling pain to the point where a human could remain functional despite catastrophic injury. But feeding without consent was one of the great crimes of her people. The act of taking blood was intimate, invasive, creating a biological connection between vampire and human that had implications both physiological and spiritual. To feed from an unconscious human, one who could not grant or deny permission, was considered little better than rape by her people's legal codes. Yet what choice did she have? To save him, to save them both, she would need her full strength. And to regain her strength, she would need to feed. The mathematics of survival were brutal and clear. She looked at him again, at his face, trying to find some answer in those unconscious features. Trying to divine what he would want, what he would choose if he could choose. Would he consent, knowing what she was? Would he understand that feeding was not murder, not violation, but a necessary exchange that could benefit them both? Or would he see her fangs descending toward his throat and die thinking he had been betrayed, that his sacrifice had been met with the very predation he had spent his life learning to fight? The internal debate raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. And then, with a decision that felt both inevitable and completely insane, she made her choice. She wouldn't feed. Not yet. Not without his consent. Not without his eyes open and his mind clear enough to understand what was happening. If that meant she remained weak, if it meant they both died here in this cave because she couldn't muster the strength to save them, then so be it. Some principles were worth dying for. Some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Instead, she would do what she could with the strength she had. She examined the cave more carefully, taking in details she had missed in those first moments of confusion. The space was larger than she had initially thought, extending back into shadows deep enough to provide complete protection from the sunlight. The entrance, where he had positioned himself, was partially collapsed, creating a natural barrier that allowed only indirect light to filter through. It was this light he had been shielding her from, his body blocking even those diffuse rays that might have reached her. There was debris everywhere. Broken stone, torn fabric, scattered remnants of the sanctuary's contents thrown here by the force of whatever explosion or collapse had occurred. Among the rubble, she spotted what looked like a water skin, miraculously intact, and a few scattered supplies that might prove useful. More importantly, she saw a way to improve their situation. Several large pieces of cloth, tapestries, banners, she couldn't tell which, lay half buried in the debris. If she could retrieve them, position them properly, she could create a light barrier that would free him from his position while still protecting her from any stray sunlight. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would allow him to rest properly, to potentially receive better care. She moved quickly, fighting through the weakness that made her limbs feel leaden and her vision occasionally blur at the edges. Each piece of fabric she retrieved felt impossibly heavy, but she forced herself to continue, draping them over the gap where sunlight entered, securing them with rocks and broken wood until she had created a patchwork barrier that, while far from elegant, would serve its purpose. Only when she was satisfied that no sunlight could reach the area where he lay did she return to him, kneeling beside his still form. Now came the harder part, moving him without causing additional injury, getting him into a position where she could better assess and potentially treat his wounds. "I need you to wake up," she told him, keeping her voice low and calm despite the urgency she felt. "I know you're in pain. I know you're exhausted. But I need you conscious. Need you to tell me what hurts most, what can wait, what needs immediate attention." No response. His breathing remained shallow and irregular, his face pale beneath the grime and blood. She tried again, this time allowing her voice to take on some of the resonance that her kind used for compelling humans. Not full compulsion, which would be both unethical and potentially dangerous in his current state, but just enough harmonic vibration to reach through the fog of pain and unconsciousness that held him. "Wake up, human. Your task isn't finished. You saved me from the light, but now we both need saving, and I cannot do it alone. Wake up." This time, she saw a response. A slight flutter of his eyelids. A barely perceptible change in his breathing pattern. He was fighting his way back to consciousness, drawn by her voice or perhaps by some stubborn refusal to surrender to his injuries. His eyes opened. They were gray, she noticed. Not the pale gray of storm clouds, but something darker, deeper. The gray of stone worn smooth by centuries of running water. The gray of smoke from a fire that had burned so long it had forgotten what it was like to be wood. Those eyes focused on her slowly, with visible effort, and she watched awareness return to them in stages. First simple consciousness, the knowledge that he existed, that the world existed. Then confusion, the recognition that something was wrong, that he was hurt, that circumstances had changed in ways he didn't understand. Then memory, she could see it crash over him like a wave, see him remember the attack, the collapse, his decision to shield her. And finally, recognition. He was looking at her, truly looking at her, for the first time. Taking in her pale skin, her dark hair, her wings that even folded were visible behind her shoulders. Understanding what she was. She waited for the fear, the revulsion, the hatred that humans were taught from childhood to feel toward her kind. Waited for him to recoil, to try to attack her despite his injuries, to curse her for the monster she was. It didn't come. Instead, after a long moment of mutual regard, the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been attempting to be a smile. "You're alive," he said, his voice rough and barely above a whisper, but carrying something that might have been satisfaction. "Good. That's good." And then, before she could respond, before she could ask any of the 1,000 questions that crowded her mind, his eyes rolled back and he slipped away into unconsciousness once more. But she had seen enough, had heard enough. In those few seconds of wakefulness, she had glimpsed something that changed everything, that made this situation even more impossible and complicated than it had already been. He had looked at her, really looked at her, seeing her for what she was, and he had been glad. Glad that she lived. Glad that his sacrifice had mattered. This human didn't just tolerate her existence. He valued it. And that, she realized with a sense of growing dread and wonder, was going to make everything infinitely more difficult. She had never given much thought to what a vigil meant. The word existed in her language, of course, a period of watching, of waiting, of maintaining awareness through hours that would otherwise pass unnoticed. But the reality of it, the lived experience of sitting beside someone hovering at the threshold between life and death, was something no amount of linguistic knowledge could have prepared her for. Hours passed. Or perhaps days. Time lost its usual structure in the cave's artificial twilight, measured only by the slow cycle of his breathing and the gradual shift of filtered light across stone. She had reinforced her barrier multiple times, adding layers of fabric and using mud from a small seep at the cave's rear to seal gaps. The result was a shelter within a shelter, a small sanctum of shadow where she could move freely without fear of the deadly sunlight that still blazed somewhere beyond her cloth walls. He drifted in and out of consciousness, never fully waking but occasionally rising close enough to the surface to mumble words she couldn't quite make out. Names, perhaps. Places. Fragments of memory or fever dreams that meant something to him but remained opaque to her. Each time he stirred, she moved closer, ready to provide what comfort or assistance she could. Each time he settled back into deeper unconsciousness, she returned to her position just beyond arm's reach, maintaining a respectful distance that felt both appropriate and frustratingly inadequate. She had done what she could for his injuries. Her people's understanding of human physiology was better than most humans realized. Centuries of interaction, both violent and otherwise, had given vampires an extensive, if somewhat clinical knowledge of how human bodies worked. She had cleaned his wounds using water from the miraculously intact skin she'd found, had straightened his legs as much as she dared, had even torn strips from one of the tapestries to create splints and bandages. But none of it was enough. The internal bleeding continued. The shock that had kept him functional during his act of protection was now working against him, shutting down non-essential systems, rerouting resources to keep his vital organs functioning. He needed real medical care, human medical care, provided by someone who understood the nuances of human healing in ways she simply didn't. He needed blood. His kind couldn't regenerate it the way hers could. Lost blood meant lost life, and he had lost so much. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was a creature who consumed blood to survive, yet she couldn't give any of hers to save him. Vampire blood was poison to humans, one of the few absolute facts about their biological incompatibility. Even a few drops introduced into a human system would cause catastrophic immune response, killing them in hours in the most agonizing way imaginable. She could take his blood and be strengthened. She could not give hers and offer strength in return. The exchange was and would always be one-directional, a biological metaphor for the power imbalance between their species that had defined centuries of conflict. The hunger was becoming difficult to ignore. She had been injured, had healed while unconscious, and healing required energy that her body wanted to replenish through feeding. The scent of his blood was everywhere, on her clothes where she had brushed against his wounds, on the bandages she had applied, in the air of the cave itself. It called to instincts that didn't care about ethics or consent or the strange protective impulse she felt toward this human. She found herself watching his throat more often than she should, watching the slow pulse of his jugular beneath skin that looked paper-thin in his weakened state, imagining how easy it would be to lean in, to let her fangs extend, to solve both their problems with one simple biological exchange that nature had designed her kind to perform. But she didn't. Wouldn't. The principle held, even as the hunger grew sharper. She needed distraction. Needed to think about something other than the steady beat of his heart and the scent of his blood and the increasingly insistent voice in the back of her mind that whispered about survival and necessity and the foolishness of allowing both of them to die for the sake of primitive morality. So she explored the cave. It was larger than she had initially realized, extending back into a series of connected chambers that spoke of ancient volcanic activity or perhaps deliberate excavation at some point in the distant past. The deeper chambers were utterly dark, the kind of absolute darkness that humans feared but her kind found comforting. She could see perfectly well, of course. Vampire eyes functioned across a broader spectrum than human vision, making darkness simply another state of light, another environment to navigate. She found signs of previous habitation. Old fire pits, long cold. Scratches on the walls that might have been tally marks or primitive writing. A few ancient bones that might have been animal or might have been something else. Whatever human or pre-human group had used this cave, they had done so long ago, leaving behind only the faintest archaeological signature of their existence. There was also, to her immense relief, a water source. The seep she had noticed earlier originated from a crack in the chamber wall, feeding a small pool that had carved itself into the stone over what must have been centuries. The water was cold and clean, tasting of minerals and deep earth. She drank deeply, feeling some of her strength return, then filled the water skin to bring back to him. When she returned to where he lay, she found him stirring again. This time there was more purpose to his movements, as if he was actively trying to wake rather than simply being pulled briefly toward consciousness by pain or physiological need. She moved to his side, kneeling in the position she had occupied for hours now. "Easy," she said softly. "Don't try to move too quickly. Your injuries are extensive." His eyes opened, and she saw they were clearer now than before. Still clouded with pain, but focused. Present. He looked at her for a long moment, and she found herself unable to look away, caught in that gray gaze that seemed to be cataloguing her features with the same intensity she had brought to studying him. "You're real," he finally said, his voice rough but stronger than it had been during his previous brief awakening. "Not a dream. Not a fever vision. Actually real." "I'm real," she confirmed. "As are you, though I suspect you're questioning that as much as I am questioning this entire situation." Something that might have been a laugh escaped him, though it turned into a wince of pain halfway through. "This situation. That's one way to describe it." He paused, clearly gathering strength for speech. "Where are we?" "A cave system, approximately 300 yards from where the sanctuary entrance used to be. You, dragged me here during the collapse. The entrance is partially blocked, which is the only reason sunlight hasn't reached deep enough to," she trailed off, unsure how to complete that sentence. "To kill you," he finished for her. "You can say it. I know what sunlight does to your kind." He shifted slightly, trying to get a better view of her, and immediately gasped as the movement apparently triggered fresh waves of pain from his legs. "How bad is it? The damage? I can feel that something's wrong, but everything's sort of distant. Shock, I think." She hesitated, unsure how much truth he could handle in his current state. But he had earned honesty through his sacrifice, had earned the dignity of knowing exactly what his choice had cost him. Both legs are crushed below the knee. Multiple compound fractures, severed tendons, extensive muscle damage. I've stabilized them as best I can, but without proper medical intervention, human medical intervention, they will not heal correctly. You're also bleeding internally, though I can't determine the exact source or severity without equipment I don't possess." She paused, then added more gently, "Even with the best care, you may not walk again. Without any care at all, you will likely die within the next day or two." She had expected fear, horror, the kind of existential breakdown that humans were supposed to experience when confronted with the reality of their own mortality and permanent disability. Instead, he simply nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already knew. "That's about what I figured. The pain has a certain quality to it. Final. Like my body's already given up, even if my mind hasn't." "Why?" The question burst from her before she could stop it, raw and urgent. "Why did you do it? Why save me? Your people and mine have been enemies for centuries. You should have left me to burn. Should have saved yourself, or at least died trying to escape. Instead she gestured helplessly at his ruined legs, at the blood-soaked bandages, at the entire impossible situation they found themselves in. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if looking at something beyond the cave walls. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality of carefully considered truth. "In the moment, I didn't think about politics or history or species differences. I just saw someone in danger. Someone who would die if I didn't act. And he paused, clearly struggling to articulate something complex. I've spent my entire life being trained to fight. To see enemies everywhere. To divide the world into us and them, threats and allies. And maybe that's useful. Maybe that's even necessary in a world as dangerous as ours. He turned his head to look directly at her. But in that moment, when I saw you, all I could think was that you were afraid. Really, genuinely afraid. And fear is the most human thing there is. It's the emotion that proves we're alive, that we value our existence, that we don't want to end. And if you could feel that kind of fear, then you weren't just a monster. You were a person. And I couldn't let a person burn. The silence that followed his words was profound. She found herself unable to respond, unable to formulate any reply that would adequately address what he had just said. No human had ever spoken to her like this. Had ever acknowledged her personhood so directly, so completely. "I'm Cale," he added after the silence had stretched. "Since we're apparently going to die together in this cave, you should probably know my name." "Seraphine," she heard herself say, offering her name in return before she could think about whether that was wise. Names had power in her culture, and giving one's true name to another was a gesture of trust that bordered on intimacy. "And we're not going to die here. Neither of us." Bold words from someone who looks like she hasn't fed in days and is trapped in a cave with a dying human. His tone was light, almost teasing, but there was an edge to it. A challenge. She stiffened, suddenly aware of how obvious her hunger must be. Vampire metabolisms ran hot when depleted, making their skin even paler than usual, bringing a certain hollowness to their features. She probably looked like a walking corpse, animated by will alone. "I don't feed without consent," she said firmly. "That's not a negotiation or a polite social nicety. It's one of my people's fundamental laws. The act of feeding creates a biological and spiritual connection between vampire and human. To take blood without permission is," she struggled for a human equivalent. "It would be like your people's concept of violation, of abuse. Some things are not acceptable regardless of necessity." Cale's expression was unreadable. "And if I gave consent, if I told you to feed, to take what you need to be strong enough to save both of us, then I would refuse anyway," she said, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. "You're not in a position to give informed consent. You're injured, in shock, likely suffering from delirium due to blood loss and pain. Any agreement you made now would be meaningless because you're not operating from a place of true autonomous choice. You've thought about this a lot. It wasn't a question. I've thought about little else since I woke up and realized what you'd done for me." She looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. "You saved my life at tremendous cost to yourself. The least I can do is not compound that cost by violating your autonomy while you're helpless to resist. Even if it means we both die." Even then. Another long silence. Then, unexpectedly, Cale laughed, a real laugh this time, not the pained half-attempt from before. It clearly hurt him, but he did it anyway, the sound filling the cave with something that might have been joy, or might have been hysteria, or might have been simple acknowledgement of the absolute absurdity of their situation. "We're idiots," he said when the laughter subsided into painful breathing. "Both of us. Complete idiots. I'm dying to save a vampire, and you're refusing to save yourself because of ethics. We deserve each other." Despite herself, despite everything, Seraphine found herself smiling. "I suppose we do." "Tell me about yourself," Cale said after a moment. "If we're going to be stuck here together, I want to know more than just your name. Where do you come from? What do you do when you're not being saved from sunlight by suicidal humans?" The question caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked about her life? About her as an individual rather than as a representative of her species or a potential threat to be eliminated. "I'm a scholar," she found herself saying. "Or I was, before the war made such pursuits seem frivolous. I studied the old languages, the texts from before the breaking, before our peoples became enemies. I wanted to understand what happened. Why we started killing each other. Whether there was ever a time when humans and vampires coexisted peacefully. And Cale prompted. What did you find? Fragments. Suggestions. Hints that the war wasn't always inevitable, that there were periods of cooperation and mutual benefit. But the records are incomplete, often deliberately destroyed by one side or the other. The truth has been buried under centuries of propaganda and counter-propaganda. She paused, then added, I was in the sanctuary researching a particular manuscript when your people attacked. It was supposed to be one of the oldest documents in existence, potentially dating from before the breaking. I never got the chance to examine it. I'm sorry, Cale said, and sounded like he meant it. For what my people did. For the attack. I wasn't part of it. I'm not a holy warrior, just a scout who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But still, I'm sorry. You have nothing to apologize for. You've done more to help me than any of your kind has in my entire life. She looked at him curiously. If you weren't part of the attack, how did you end up in the sanctuary? He was quiet for a moment, and she sensed she was approaching sensitive territory. But he had been honest with her, had quite literally put his life on the line for her. She thought he deserved to know she would extend the same trust in return, even if his answer proved uncomfortable. I was tracking someone, he finally said. A member of my unit who had gone missing 3 days prior. His trail led to the area around the sanctuary, and I followed. I was trying to determine if he had been captured or killed or had simply deserted. I didn't know about the planned attack. My superiors don't usually inform scouts about tactical operations. He laughed bitterly. Probably because they knew I would have objected. The holy warriors aren't known for their restraint or their adherence to military protocols. You sound like you have personal experience with them. My father was one. A commander, actually. Very devoted to the cause of vampire extinction. Very certain that your kind were demons wearing flesh, incapable of reason or mercy or anything resembling humanity. His voice had gone flat, emotionless. He died 5 years ago in a raid that went wrong. The vampires his unit attacked fought back harder than expected. By the time reinforcements arrived, most of both sides were dead. I'm sorry, Seraphine said, echoing his earlier apology. Don't be. He was a bastard who loved his holy mission more than he ever loved his family. His death freed me from an obligation to follow in his footsteps. He paused. But it also made me wonder. Wonder if the vampires who killed him were evil monsters like he always claimed, or if they were just people trying to survive, defending their home from invaders who wanted them dead. And what conclusion did you reach? That the question was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. That maybe both things could be true simultaneously. That maybe reducing either species to simple categories of good or evil was the real problem. He looked at her directly. Meeting you has rather confirmed that hypothesis. They fell into a more comfortable silence after that, though Seraphine's mind churned with implications. This human, this Cale, was not what she had been taught to expect. He possessed a thoughtfulness, a willingness to question received wisdom that seemed rare in any species. She found herself wanting to keep talking to him, to learn more about his perspective, to understand how someone raised in a culture of mutual hatred could arrive at such nuanced conclusions. But there were more practical concerns demanding attention. We need to make plans, she said eventually. Figure out how to get out of this situation. I've secured the cave against sunlight for now, but my barriers won't last forever. Eventually the cloth will deteriorate, or animals will disturb it, or weather conditions will change. We need to move before that happens. I can't move, Cale said flatly. Not with these legs. Even if you could somehow carry me, which I doubt given your weakened state, any jostling would likely kill me through shock or by triggering fatal internal bleeding. Then we wait for night, and I go for help. Help from whom? Your people were attacked. If any survived, they're either dead, captured, or scattered. They're not going to risk sending a search party for one scholar who might already be Ash. And my people, he trailed off, the implication clear. His people would be even less likely to help rescue a vampire. So what do you suggest? She tried to keep the frustration from her voice. That we simply accept death. Wait here until your injuries claim you, and then I either starve or face the sun. I suggest, Cale said carefully, that you stop being so damned noble and accept the help I'm trying to offer. Feed from me. Take enough to restore your strength. Then you'll be capable of making decisions from a position of actual capability rather than theoretical ethics. We've been through this. No, you've been through this. You've decided unilaterally that I'm not capable of making autonomous choices because I'm injured. But Seraphine, I'm completely lucid right now. In pain, yes. Aware that I'm probably dying, yes. But I understand exactly what I'm offering and why. This isn't delirium. This is a conscious choice made by someone who would rather die having saved one life than die having accomplished nothing. She wanted to refuse. Wanted to maintain the moral high ground that felt increasingly like stubborn pride rather than genuine principle. But there was logic to his argument that she couldn't easily dismiss. And more than that, there was the unavoidable reality of their situation. He was right. She was too weak to help either of them. Every hour she waited, more of his blood soaked into the cave floor, more of his life drained away, more of her strength faded. There would be consequences, she said quietly, beyond the immediate exchange of blood. My saliva contains compounds that would create a temporary bond between us. You would be able to sense my emotions to some degree. I would be able to influence your emotional state, though I swear I would not abuse that capability. The connection would fade after a few days, but while it lasted, it would be intimate. Invasive, possibly. Disturbing, certainly. Would it hurt? The feeding itself? No. The opposite, actually. My saliva contains analgesics and compounds that trigger pleasure responses in humans. It's an evolutionary adaptation. Prey that doesn't struggle is easier to feed from. You would feel, she searched for appropriate words. Euphoria, probably. A sense of profound relaxation and well-being. Some humans describe it as better than any drug they've experienced. And you? What would you feel? The question was more personal than he probably realized. Feeding was intensely pleasurable for vampires, tapping into instincts and sensations that had no real equivalent in human experience. It was simultaneously physiological satisfaction, emotional connection, and something that bordered on spiritual communion. To feed from someone was to know them in ways that transcended normal intimacy. It would feel necessary, she said carefully. And beyond that, I'd rather not elaborate. Cale nodded slowly, accepting her reluctance. Then do it. Feed from me. Save your strength so you can save both of us. That's my decision, made with full understanding of the consequences. Will you accept my consent, or are you going to let both of us die to preserve some abstract moral principle? She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Found none. Just determination, and perhaps a hint of something else. Trust, maybe. Or hope. If I do this, she said slowly, I am in your debt. By my people's laws, I will owe you a life debt that can only be repaid through equivalent service or sacrifice. Do you understand what that means? That you'll owe me one? Seems fair, given that I already owe you for not eating me while I was unconscious. His attempt at humor fell flat, but she appreciated the effort. It means, she said seriously, that your life becomes bound to mine in ways that transcend normal obligation. It means that should you call on me for aid, I would be honor-bound to provide it regardless of personal cost or danger. It means that harming you would be considered equivalent to harming family by my people's customs. It means we become important to each other, Cale interrupted gently. Important in ways that make this whole situation even more complicated than it already is. I understand, Seraphine. And I accept it. All of it. She found she had no more arguments. No more rational objections to offer against the simple, devastating logic of survival and mutual necessity. He was offering her life. She was offering him a chance, however slim, of continued existence. The exchange might be unequal, might be complicated, might create bonds and obligations that neither of them fully understood yet. But it was honest, and it was offered freely. And sometimes that had to be enough. Very well, she said, allowing her voice to take on the formal cadence used for serious oaths. I accept your consent and your blood gift. I swear by my name and my line that I will use the strength I gain to ensure your survival to the best of my abilities. I swear that I will not abuse the connection created by this feeding. And I swear that your life debt to me will be honored and repaid according to our oldest laws. That's a lot of swearing for what's essentially dinner, Cale observed, but his voice was gentle, acknowledging the solemnity of the moment. We take such things seriously, Seraphine replied. Blood is sacred to my people. The act of feeding is not casual, not simple consumption. It is. She struggled for words. It is the acknowledgement that life sustains life, that we are all connected through the fundamental currency of existence itself. She moved closer, positioning herself beside him. Her hands were shaking, she realized, not from hunger, though that was certainly present, but from the significance of what she was about to do. She had fed before, of course. One did not reach her age without having participated in the biological necessity of her species. But those had been formal feedings, carefully regulated, often from willing human donors who offered their blood in exchange for various benefits that vampire patronage could provide. This was different. This was personal. This was feeding from someone who mattered, whose life mattered, whose survival was bound up with her own in ways that made the act feel less like sustenance and more like communion. It will be easier if you turn your head to the side, she instructed quietly. Expose your neck fully, and try to relax. Tension makes the process more difficult for both of us. Cale complied, shifting his head to give her clear access to the major vessels in his neck. She could see his pulse there, just beneath the skin, steady and strong despite his injuries. Could smell the richness of his blood, the complex chemistry that made each human's essence unique and identifiable. She leaned closer, close enough that her breath would ghost across his skin. Last chance to change your mind, she whispered. Stop stalling and get on with it, he replied, and there was humor in his voice but also trust. Complete, devastating trust. She let her fangs extend, a sensation that was always slightly uncomfortable, like the emergence of teeth that didn't quite fit properly in her mouth. They were designed for this purpose, hollow and connected to the saliva glands that would inject the necessary compounds to make feeding painless and pleasurable for her meal. Her partner. The word felt more appropriate given the circumstances. Her lips brushed his skin, feeling the heat of him, the life of him. She paused for one more heartbeat, giving him one final opportunity to resist or reject what was about to happen. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just waited, trusting her completely. She bit down. The piercing of skin was quick, practiced, designed to minimize trauma. Her fangs slid through flesh and into the vessel beneath with surgical precision. She felt his body tense for a moment, instinctive reaction to injury, and then relax as her saliva began to work, flooding his system with compounds that would transform pain into pleasure, fear into euphoria. And then the blood came, and with it, everything changed. The taste was extraordinary. Each human's blood carried its own unique signature, flavored by diet and genetics and 1,000 subtle factors that made them individually identifiable. But this, Cale's blood, was something beyond her experience. There was strength in it, certainly, the vitality of someone who had lived hard and survived. But there was also something else. A quality she couldn't quite name. Courage, perhaps. Stubbornness. The essential character of someone who looked at impossible situations and refused to accept defeat. She drank slowly, carefully, taking only what she needed while being mindful of his weakened state. Too much would kill him. Too little would leave her too weak to help them both. She had to find the precise balance, had to listen to his heartbeat and his breathing and the subtle signals his body sent about its reserves and limitations. And then there was the connection. She had warned him it would be intimate, but words were inadequate preparation for the reality of it. As his blood entered her system and her saliva entered his, something opened between them, not telepathy exactly, but something close. Emotional resonance. She could feel what he felt, the strange pleasure-pain of feeding mixing with relief that she was becoming stronger, mixing with a bone-deep exhaustion that suggested just how close to death he really was. And beneath it all, surprisingly, was peace. He wasn't afraid. Wasn't regretting his choice. He was simply content. Content to have made a choice that mattered, to have used his life for something he considered worthwhile. The realization made her throat tighten with emotion that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the incredible, incomprehensible beauty of this moment. This human, this stranger who owed her nothing, was giving her life freely, joyfully, with no expectation of reward or even survival. She pulled away before she wanted to, before she had taken as much as she could have justified taking. Because she realized that to take more would be to prioritize her strength over his life, and that was a line she could not cross. Would not cross. Her tongue sealed the wounds, a final gift of her saliva ensuring they would close cleanly without infection or excessive scarring. When she sat back, she could see the marks she had left, 2 small punctures that would heal to nearly invisible scars. Evidence of what had passed between them. Cale's eyes were half closed, his expression one of profound relaxation despite his injuries. That was, he trailed off, apparently unable to find words. I know, she said softly. Thank you. For your trust. For your gift. For, she gestured helplessly at everything. The cave, the situation, his sacrifice. For all of it. Feeling stronger. His words were slightly slurred now, exhaustion finally claiming him in ways that injury alone hadn't managed. Yes. Not fully restored, but enough. Enough to make a difference. She reached out to touch his forehead gently, a gesture of comfort and gratitude. Sleep now. I'll watch over you. And when you wake, we'll find a way out of this together. He was already slipping away, pulled down into sleep or unconsciousness by his body's desperate need for rest and recovery. But just before he went entirely, she heard him whisper, "Together. I like that." And then he was gone, breathing deeply and evenly, finally allowing himself to truly rest for the first time since he had dragged her from the collapsing sanctuary. Seraphine sat back, feeling the borrowed vitality singing through her veins. She was still weak, still far from her full strength, but the difference was profound. She could think clearly now, could move without feeling like she was wading through deep water, could actually imagine a future beyond the next few hours. She looked at Cale's sleeping form, at this impossible human who had changed everything with his incomprehensible act of compassion, and felt something shift in her chest. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or the recognition of debt, or perhaps simply the acknowledgement that some connections transcended species and history and all the rational reasons they should have remained strangers. "I will save you," she promised quietly, speaking to his unconscious form. "I swear it on my name and my blood and everything I am. You gave me life. I will return the favor, whatever it takes." The cave was silent except for the sound of his breathing and the distant drip of water from the seep in the back chamber. But in that silence, Seraphine began to plan, began to calculate, began to consider what resources they had, what options remained, what impossible solutions might be crafted from the raw materials of desperation and newly restored strength. They would survive this. Both of them. Because anything else was unacceptable. Because he had made himself matter to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Because some debts could only be repaid with life itself. Night came finally, bringing with it the kind of relief that only those who feared the sun could truly understand. Seraphine felt at the moment the last rays of daylight withdrew from the world beyond the cave, a subtle shift in the quality of light filtering through her makeshift barriers, a change in the air itself that signaled the transition from hostile day to welcoming night. Her people were not nocturnal by preference but by necessity, driven into the hours of darkness by a sun that promised only death. But over centuries, necessity had been transformed into culture, until night itself had become not just safe but sacred, the time when her kind truly lived, truly thrived, truly felt at home in a world that otherwise rejected them. She had spent the remaining daylight hours in careful preparation, had gathered every supply the cave offered, had organized what little medical equipment she had improvised, had planned and replanned her next moves with the kind of obsessive detail that suggested just how little margin for error remained. Cale's condition had stabilized somewhat after she fed. The connection between them allowed her to monitor his vital signs with unusual precision, but stabilization was not improvement. He remained critically injured, hovering in that uncertain space between death and recovery that could tip either direction with the slightest provocation. She needed help. Real help, from people who understood human medicine and possessed the tools and knowledge to actually address his injuries. But where to find such help when her people were scattered or dead and his people would likely kill her on sight? The answer had come to her slowly, reluctantly, weighted with implications she didn't want to examine too closely. She would have to reveal who she was. Seraphine had been traveling in disguise when she visited the sanctuary, a common enough practice for someone of her station who wanted to study ancient texts without the constant weight of protocol and expectation. She had presented herself as a simple scholar, a nobody from one of the lesser vampire houses, someone whose death would be mourned but not investigated too thoroughly. It had been liberating in its way. For the first time in her life, people had reacted to her based on what she said and did rather than on the weight of her name and title. But anonymity was a luxury she could no longer afford. Because Seraphine was not just a scholar. Not just a vampire trying to survive in a world that wanted her kind dead. She was Seraphine Nightborn, third daughter of House Nightborn, one of the 7 great vampire houses that had ruled their people since before written history. She was a princess of the Eternal Courts, a holder of ancient titles, someone whose capture or death would have political implications that rippled far beyond one life or one cave. And more importantly, she was someone whose name could command resources. The realization sat heavy in her chest. She had kept her identity secret for so long, had enjoyed the freedom of being treated as an equal rather than a superior, that the thought of reclaiming her title felt almost like a betrayal. A betrayal of what? She couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps of the version of herself she had been allowed to be in this cave, speaking honestly with a human who saw her as simply Seraphine rather than as Princess Seraphine of House Nightborn. But Cale's life hung in the balance, and personal preferences seemed trivial in comparison. She spent the first hour after full darkness performing reconnaissance, slipping out of the cave to scout the surrounding area. The destruction was worse than she had feared. The sanctuary had been utterly destroyed, reduced to rubble and ash by whatever combination of weapons and righteous fury the holy warriors had brought to bear. Bodies lay scattered among the ruins, both vampire and human, neither side having emerged unscathed from the confrontation. The sight made her throat tight with grief and rage in equal measure, though she forced both emotions down. There would be time for mourning later. Now was for action. She moved like a shadow through the debris field, using every skill her instructors had drilled into her since childhood. Vampires were ambush predators by nature, designed for stealth and sudden violence, and while Seraphine had never been particularly interested in the combat applications of her abilities, she remembered the lessons well enough to apply them now. Silent footsteps, minimal disturbance of the environment, constant awareness of sight lines and potential threats. The holy warriors had established a perimeter camp about half a mile from the sanctuary ruins, close enough to prevent any survivors from escaping, far enough to avoid whatever dangers might lurk in the destroyed underground chambers. She counted approximately 30 soldiers, which suggested this had been a significant operation but not an all-out assault. There would be more forces somewhere, either already departed or waiting to converge if their advance unit encountered problems. More importantly, she spotted what she had been hoping to find, a communications tent. Modern military forces didn't operate in isolation. They maintained contact with command structures, updated superiors on mission progress, coordinated with other units. Which meant they had communication equipment. Which meant she could potentially send a message. Getting to that tent without being detected would be nearly impossible under normal circumstances. But Seraphine had advantages that normal vampires lacked. Advantages that came with her royal blood. She found a position of relative concealment behind the twisted remnants of what had once been a sanctuary watchtower. Closed her eyes. Reached down into that part of herself she rarely accessed, the place where her bloodline gifts lived, waiting to be called upon. Each of the great vampire houses possessed unique abilities passed through generations, genetic inheritance mixed with something that might have been magic or might simply have been biology so advanced it resembled magic. House Nightborne's gift was shadow manipulation, not invisibility exactly, but the ability to bend light and perception in ways that made them incredibly difficult to detect when they didn't want to be seen. She hadn't used this ability in years. Had avoided it, actually, uncomfortable with the way it set her apart from common vampires, uncomfortable with the reminder of privilege and power she had been trying to escape. But she used it now, feeling the familiar sensation of reality bending around her as she became something less than visible and more than invisible. A presence that eyes simply slid away from, that minds registered as part of the background rather than as a threat requiring attention. Moving like this required enormous concentration and energy, but her recent feeding had restored enough strength to make it possible. She drifted toward the camp, moving between shadows real and created, until she stood just outside the communications tent. Inside, she could hear voices, 2 soldiers discussing casualty counts and extraction timelines. She waited until their conversation shifted to other matters, until their attention was focused away from the equipment, and then she slipped inside. The communications array was more sophisticated than she had hoped, military grade, with encryption and satellite link-up that suggested these holy warriors had significant backing from someone with deep pockets. She ignored the complexity, focusing instead on what she needed, a single secure channel, a single message sent to a single receiver. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, typing in code she had memorized years ago and hoped were still valid. The message itself was brief, encoded in a cipher that only a handful of people alive still knew. Nightborne III in critical situation. Sanctuary destroyed. Require immediate extraction and medical assistance for human companion. Current location. Coordinates. Respond if operational. She sent it, then immediately began covering her digital tracks, wiping logs and rerouting records to make it appear as though the message had never been sent at all. It was risky. If anyone examined the system closely, they might find evidence of her intrusion. But by then she would either be rescued or dead, making the discovery somewhat moot. She was halfway back to the cave when the response came. Not through the communications equipment. She wouldn't have received that. Instead, it came through a different channel entirely, one that required no technology at all. A presence. Vast and ancient and utterly unmistakable. Touching her mind with the delicacy of a sword resting against one's throat. 3 weeks we searched. 3 weeks of wondering if you were Ash, little princess. Your father is going to have words with you about this disappearing act. Seraphine would have laughed if she hadn't been so focused on maintaining her shadow form. The presence was Mordred, her father's seneschal and probably the oldest vampire still functioning in the modern world. He had been ancient when her great-great-grandmother was born, had served House Nightborne since its founding, and possessed abilities that made her shadow manipulation look like a party trick. Forgive my discourtesy, seneschal. She shaped the thought carefully, sending it back along the connection he had established. Circumstances have been complicated. So I gather. The holy warriors are remarkably chatty once you get past the screaming. We've been tracking this particular unit for days, wondering where they were going in such a hurry. Now we know. Relief flooded through her. If Mordred was here, that meant a full recovery team was probably nearby. Which meant salvation for both her and Cale. I'm not alone, seneschal. I have a human with me. Critically injured. He saved my life at tremendous cost to himself. I've sworn him protection and incurred a life debt that must be honored. The presence in her mind went very still, and Seraphine felt a flicker of apprehension. Mordred was utterly loyal to her father and to House Nightborne, But he was also a pragmatist who had survived millennia by making hard choices. A human traveling with a vampire princess, protected by life debt. The political complications were staggering. "Explain," he commanded, his mental voice leaving no room for evasion. So she did, quickly and concisely. Told him about the collapse, about waking beneath Cale, about his sacrifice and her feeding and the impossible situation they now found themselves in. She left out nothing, knowing that Mordred would detect any attempt at deception and that her best chance of securing help required complete honesty about the circumstances. When she finished, the silence that followed was profound and deeply uncomfortable. "You do understand," Mordred finally said, "that this changes everything. A human who saved a vampire princess. Protected by life debt. Connected to you through blood bond. The political implications alone are enough to trigger a diplomatic crisis. Some houses will see this as opportunity. Others will see it as weakness to be exploited. Your father will have to navigate treacherous waters to ensure this doesn't destabilize the entire court structure." "I know." And she did, had been thinking about little else during the hours of daylight while Cale slept. "But it doesn't change my obligation or my oath. He lives, seneschal. Whatever political complications arise, he lives. That's not negotiable." Another pause. Then, surprisingly, she felt something that might have been approval coloring the presence in her mind. "Your mother would have said the same. Very well, little princess. We'll extract you both. I'm dispatching a team now. They'll reach your location within the hour. But know this, when we return you to the court, there will be consequences. For you. For him. For the very possibility of human-vampire cooperation. You've set things in motion that cannot easily be stopped. I understand. I wonder if you do." But the words carried no malice, only a kind of weary wisdom. "Until the extraction team arrives, stay hidden. Stay safe. And Seraphine, your father will be immensely relieved you're alive. Try to remember that during the argument you're about to have with him about this entire mess." The presence withdrew, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the long walk back to the cave where Cale waited. She moved more carefully now, abandoning her shadow form to conserve strength. The extraction team Mordred mentioned was probably already mobilizing. Vampire special forces trained specifically for recovery operations in hostile territory. They would get her and Cale out safely. But what happened after that remained uncertain. She reached the cave just as the first signs of the approaching team became apparent. Subtle distortions in the darkness that indicated vampires moving with military precision. She positioned herself at the cave entrance, making herself visible, ensuring they would recognize her before they decided she might be a threat. 6 vampires materialized from the shadows, all of them wearing the black and silver of House Nightborne's elite guard. The leader, a tall female vampire with scars that suggested extensive combat experience, dropped to one knee immediately upon seeing Seraphine, a formal gesture of respect reserved for royalty. "Your Highness, we've been ordered to extract you and your companion with all possible speed. If you'll permit us to assess the situation." "Inside," Seraphine interrupted. "My companion is critically injured and cannot be moved roughly. I'll need your medical specialist to examine him before we attempt any extraction." The team moved with impressive efficiency, 2 of them immediately establishing a defensive perimeter while the others entered the cave to assess Cale's condition. The medical specialist, a compact vampire male who introduced himself as Cassius, knelt beside Cale with an expression that managed to be both professionally neutral and deeply skeptical. "A human," he observed unnecessarily. "Your Highness, you understand that my training is primarily in vampire physiology. I can provide basic trauma care for humans, but anything complex. Do what you can. Stabilize him for transport. We'll arrange proper human medical care once we reach safety." She watched as Cassius began a careful examination, noting the way Cale stirred slightly at the unfamiliar touch. "He's under my protection. Anyone who harms him answers to me personally." "Understood, Your Highness." Cassius's hands moved with practiced competence, checking vitals and examining injuries with a kind of clinical detachment that suggested he had done this many times before. Extensive trauma to lower extremities. Internal bleeding, partially clotted but still problematic. Blood pressure dangerously low. He needs transfusion, surgery, and probably several weeks of intensive care. He looked up at her. You fed from him. It wasn't a question, but Seraphine answered anyway. I did. With his full consent and knowledge. That explains why he's still alive. Your saliva contains coagulants that likely prevented him from bleeding out completely. Cassius returned his attention to his patient. I can give him fluids, stabilize him chemically, and provide analgesics for transport. But Your Highness, I want to be clear. His prognosis is poor. Even with the best human medical intervention, he may not survive. And if he does survive, he'll likely never regain full function of his legs. Then we make sure he survives, Seraphine said firmly. And we deal with the rest as it comes. Cassius nodded and began pulling supplies from the medical kit he carried. While he worked, the team leader, who had introduced herself as Captain Lissa, approached Seraphine with a kind of carefully neutral expression that suggested she had questions she wasn't sure it was appropriate to ask. Your Highness, with respect, the seneschal indicated this human is under life debt protection. Can you confirm that's accurate? It is. He saved my life at tremendous personal cost. I fed from him with his consent. We are bound by blood bond and life debt according to our oldest laws. Lissa's expression didn't change, but Seraphine saw the slight widening of her eyes that indicated surprise. That's unusual, Your Highness. To my knowledge, no royal has claimed life debt with a human in at least 3 centuries. The political implications are my concern, not yours, Captain. Seraphine kept her voice level but firm. Your orders are to extract us both safely. Everything else is above your authority level. Of course, Your Highness. My apologies. Lissa stepped back, properly chastened. Seraphine felt a pang of guilt at the sharp tone. Lissa was only doing her job, and her concerns were valid. But she couldn't afford to show weakness or uncertainty, not now. The rescue team needed to see her as decisive, as in control, as someone whose orders would be followed without question. Royal authority was a performance as much as a reality, and she was badly out of practice. It took Cassius about 20 minutes to prepare Cale for transport. During that time, Cale drifted partially awake several times, his eyes finding Seraphine's face with gratifying consistency despite his obvious disorientation. She stayed close, offering what reassurance she could through the blood bond that connected them. Calm. Safety. Protection. Simple emotional messages that required no words. When Cassius finally declared him ready to move, 2 of the larger team members carefully lifted Cale onto an improvised stretcher, a lightweight composite material that apparently folded down small enough to fit in a tactical pack. Cale made a small sound of pain as they positioned him, and Seraphine was at his side immediately, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. We're leaving, she told him quietly. Going somewhere you can receive proper medical care. Try not to move. Let them carry you. His eyes focused on her with obvious effort. Seraphine. His voice was barely a whisper. What's happening? Where? Sure. Later. Questions later. Sleep now. She pushed calm through their bond, reinforcing the chemical sedatives Cassius had administered. You're safe. I promise. He tried to say something else, but the combination of drugs and exhaustion pulled him back under before he could form words. His hand went slack in hers, though she noted he didn't entirely release his grip. Even unconscious, some part of him was still trying to maintain contact. The journey back was conducted with military precision. The team moved in formation, weapons ready, constantly scanning for threats. They avoided the Holy Warrior camp entirely, taking a circuitous route through terrain that looked utterly inhospitable but which the team navigated as if following a map only they could see. About 3 miles from the sanctuary ruins, they reached an extraction point where a vehicle waited, something that looked like a cross between an armored personnel carrier and a luxury transport, painted matte black and nearly invisible in the darkness. The team loaded Cale inside with impressive care, settling him onto a medical bed that looked far more sophisticated than anything Seraphine had expected. Cassius immediately began hooking up monitoring equipment and forelines, his movements efficient and practiced. "We'll have him at the facility within 2 hours," he told Seraphine. "They're preparing a human specialist team now. We've called in favors from some of the human doctors who work with us. He'll receive the best care available." "Human doctors who work with you?" Seraphine couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "I didn't know we maintained such relationships." "Most don't, Your Highness. But House Nightborne has always been more progressive in its approach to human interaction. Your father believes in maintaining channels of communication and cooperation even during times of conflict. Some humans are sympathetic to our cause, or at least willing to accept payment for services rendered without asking too many questions." It was a revelation that raised as many questions as it answered, but Seraphine filed those questions away for later consideration. Right now, her focus needed to remain on Cale and ensuring he survived the transport to wherever this facility was. The vehicle began moving, its suspension system so advanced that Seraphine barely felt the motion despite the rough terrain they were traversing. She positioned herself beside Cale's bed, maintaining physical contact, one hand resting on his arm, feeling his pulse through the thin barrier of his skin. Captain Lissa took the seat across from her, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly wanting to brief Seraphine on what to expect. "Your Highness, the Seneschal asked me to prepare you for your arrival. Your father is at the facility. He's concerned about your welfare, about the situation, about the political implications. He's asked that you brief him immediately upon arrival." "Of course." Seraphine kept her eyes on Cale rather than meeting Lissa's gaze. "What's the overall situation? The sanctuary, the other survivors, the extent of the attack?" Lissa's expression grew grim. "Casualties were heavy, Your Highness. We estimate approximately 70% of the sanctuary's population was killed in the initial assault or died in the collapse. Another 20% are missing, presumed captured or dead. We've recovered maybe a dozen survivors so far, most of them critically injured." The numbers hit like physical blows. Seraphine had known the destruction was extensive, but hearing it quantified made it real in ways that visual evidence hadn't. All those people, all those lives, gone because the holy warriors had decided a vampire sanctuary couldn't be tolerated. And the attackers? The Holy Warrior unit that conducted the raid suffered approximately 40% casualties. We've captured some of the survivors for questioning. The rest retreated to their base camp and are likely reporting back to their superiors. Lissa paused. "Your Highness, this attack wasn't random. It was well-planned, well-equipped, and executed with intelligence that suggests they had inside information about the sanctuary's layout and defenses." "You think we have a traitor?" "I think it's a possibility that needs investigation. The sanctuary's location was supposed to be secret. The fact that the Holy Warriors found it at all suggests either sophisticated surveillance or information provided by someone with inside knowledge." Seraphine absorbed this news with a growing sense of unease. A traitor among her people would explain many things, but it also opened up possibilities she didn't want to consider. Who would betray their own kind? What could the humans possibly offer that would be worth the deaths of so many vampires? The vehicle journey passed in a blur of medical monitoring and strategic briefings. Cassius kept up a running commentary on Cale's vital signs, which remained stable but weak. Lissa provided updates on the broader situation, troop movements, political reactions, the early stages of what was likely to become a diplomatic incident between the vampire houses and various human factions. They arrived at the facility just as Cassius had promised, 2 hours almost to the minute. The place was underground, as Seraphine had expected. Vampires preferred subterranean spaces, places where sunlight could never reach even by accident. But this was far more sophisticated than any vampire structure she had seen before. The entrance alone involved multiple layers of security, each one requiring biometric verification and coded clearances. The interior looked like something out of a high-tech medical drama. Clean white walls, advanced equipment humming quietly, staff moving with purposeful efficiency. And humans. Not many, but enough to notice. Human medical personnel wearing scrubs and ID badges that marked them as consultants or specialists. A full medical team was waiting when they brought Cale in, descending on him with practiced coordination. Seraphine found herself gently but firmly moved aside as they took over his care, transferring him from the vehicle's medical bed to a more sophisticated gurney and wheeling him toward what was apparently an emergency surgical suite. "Your Highness." Cassius placed a gentle hand on her arm, stopping her from following. "You need to let them work. They're the best trauma surgeons available, human and vampire working together. He's in the best possible hands. I promised I'd protect him." The words came out more desperate than she intended. "I can't just." "You can and you must. You've done everything possible to save his life. Now you need to let the professionals take over." His voice was kind but firm. "Besides, I believe your father is waiting to speak with you." The seneschal indicated it was urgent. Seraphine wanted to argue, wanted to insist on staying with Cale, but she recognized the wisdom in Cassius's words. She would only be in the way in the surgical suite, and her presence might actually complicate matters if it distracted the medical team. "Fine." She straightened, calling on reserves of royal composure that felt thin and inadequate. "But I want updates. Every hour. On his condition, his prognosis, every significant change. Is that clear?" "Absolutely, Your Highness." Captain Lissa appeared at her shoulder. "If you'll follow me, Your Highness. Your father is in the conference wing." The walk through the facility gave Seraphine time to compose herself, to prepare for the confrontation she knew was coming. Her father loved her. She had never doubted that. But he was also the head of House Nightborn, responsible for the safety and political standing of thousands of vampires. Personal feelings had to be balanced against broader responsibilities, and she had just handed him a situation that threatened to complicate both their personal relationship and his political position. The conference wing was notably more luxurious than the medical areas they had passed through. Rich carpets, elegant furniture, artwork that spanned centuries. This was where important diplomatic meetings happened, where deals were struck and alliances formed. The fact that her father had chosen to meet her here rather than in more casual quarters suggested this would be a formal discussion, not a family reunion. Lissa opened an ornate door and gestured for Seraphine to enter. "Your Highness." The room beyond was dominated by a large conference table of dark wood, probably oak, polished to a mirror shine. Maps and documents covered one wall, digital displays showed tactical information on another. And standing by the window, currently showing a recorded view of a nighttime cityscape since they were underground, was her father. Lord Alexander Nightborn looked exactly as she remembered him. Tall, imposing, with the kind of presence that made people take notice even when he wasn't speaking. His hair was silver, not from age, vampires didn't gray, but by natural coloring that ran in their bloodline. His eyes were the same gray as her own, storm-dark and penetrating. He wore formal house attire, the black and silver that marked him as not just a vampire but as the ruler of one of the great houses. He turned as she entered, and for a moment she saw past the lord and political leader to the father beneath. Saw relief and love and fear all warring for dominance in his expression before his royal composure reasserted itself. "Seraphine." His voice was carefully neutral. "I'm relieved you're safe." "Father." She inclined her head in the formal greeting required by protocol. "I apologize for any concern my absence may have caused." "Concern." He let the word hang in the air between them. An interesting choice of phrasing for what has been 3 weeks of barely controlled panic. "We thought you were dead, daughter. The attack on the sanctuary, the reports of casualties, no word from you despite multiple attempts at communication. What were we supposed to think? I was traveling anonymously. I didn't want." "You didn't want the attention that comes with your station." "Yes, I'm aware." You've been quite vocal about your desire for independence, for the opportunity to be something other than Princess Seraphine of House Nightborn. He moved away from the window, his movements carrying the kind of controlled grace that came from centuries of practice. But independence comes with responsibility, daughter. Responsibility to let people know you're alive. Responsibility to not cause international incidents by forming blood bonds with enemy humans. There it was. The core issue laid out with characteristic directness. He's not an enemy, Seraphine said quietly. He saved my life at tremendous personal cost. He's kind and thoughtful and brave, and he deserves to be protected regardless of his species. I don't doubt any of that. Mordred briefed me on the circumstances, and I'm genuinely grateful to this human for preserving your life. Her father's expression softened slightly. But Seraphine, you must understand the position this puts us in. A vampire princess blood-bonded to a human. Protected by life debt. Currently recovering in our most secure medical facility. The other houses will see this as either weakness or opportunity or both. There will be calls for him to be eliminated to prevent any intelligence he might possess from reaching human authorities. There will be suggestions that you've been compromised, that the blood bond has created loyalties that override your duty to your people. Then they'll be wrong. Seraphine kept her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. Cale, that's his name, Father, Cale, not the human or the problem. Cale has done nothing but help me. He doesn't even know who I really am. He thinks I'm just a scholar who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her father's eyebrows rose. You didn't tell him you're royal? The topic never came up. We were rather busy trying not to die. She met his gaze steadily. And I saw no reason to complicate an already impossible situation by adding political dimensions to it. Those political dimensions exist whether you acknowledge them or not. Her father sighed, and for a moment he looked tired, genuinely tired in a way that vampires rarely displayed. Daughter, I understand your position. I even respect it. But we need to address the practical realities of this situation. When this human wakes up, he's going to find himself in a vampire medical facility, surrounded by beings his people have been taught to fear and hate. He's going to have questions. And sooner or later, he's going to learn exactly who you are and what your protection means. How do you think he'll react? The question struck home because Seraphine had been asking herself the same thing. Cale had been brave and compassionate when he thought he was saving a nobody. But how would he react when he learned he had blood-bonded himself to vampire royalty? When he realized that his act of compassion had entangled him in political complications that spanned centuries? I don't know, she admitted quietly. But I have to believe he'll understand. That he'll see past the politics to the fundamental reality of what happened between us. You're placing a lot of faith in someone you've known for less than a day. He placed his life in my hands. Literally. The least I can do is extend him the same trust. Her father was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something new, something he hadn't noticed before. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality of thoughtful consideration. You care about him. Beyond gratitude. Beyond life debt obligation. You actually care what happens to this human. It wasn't a question, but Seraphine answered anyway. Yes. I know it's complicated. I know it's potentially dangerous. But yes, I care. He made me matter when he had no reason to. When doing so cost him everything. How could I not care about someone like that? Your mother would have said the same thing. A small smile touched her father's lips, the first genuine warmth she had seen since entering the room. She always did lead with her heart, consequences be damned. I see a lot of her in you right now. Is that approval I'm hearing? It's acceptance of reality, and perhaps a small measure of pride that my daughter has inherited her mother's capacity for impossible compassion. He moved to the conference table, gesturing for her to join him. But acceptance doesn't mean we can ignore the practical problems this situation creates. We need to plan. Need to decide how to handle the political fallout, how to ensure your human safety, and how to navigate the extremely complex diplomatic situation we're about to face. Seraphine took the seat he indicated, feeling some of the tension drain from her shoulders. This she could work with. This was her father, the strategist, the leader who had maintained House Nightborne's position through countless crises. If he was willing to plan rather than simply order her to abandon Kale, then there was hope. First question, her father said, pulling up a digital display that showed what looked like medical reports. Do we believe he'll survive? Because if his prognosis is poor, some of these complications resolve themselves, however unfortunate that would be. He'll survive. Seraphine spoke with more confidence than she entirely felt. He's stubborn and strong, and he has reason to live. He'll make it. Very well. Assuming survival, next question. What do we tell him? When he wakes, when he starts asking questions, how much truth do we provide? All of it. The answer came without hesitation. He deserves to know the full situation, including my identity and what it means. I won't build our connection on lies or omissions. Her father nodded as if he had expected that response. Admirably honest, but potentially problematic. If he knows you're royal, knows the location of this facility, knows the extent of our medical capabilities and human-vampire cooperation, that's sensitive information that could be extremely dangerous in the wrong hands. You think he'd betray us? I think he's human, raised in a culture that views us as monsters, who has just gone through a traumatic experience and will be recovering in what might seem like captivity. People under stress make unpredictable choices. We need to plan for worst-case scenarios while hoping for best-case outcomes. It was pragmatic reasoning that Seraphine couldn't easily argue against. But something in her rebelled at the idea of Kale as a potential threat, as someone who needed to be managed and controlled rather than trusted. What if we gave him the choice? The words came slowly, the idea forming as she spoke. What if we told him everything, explained the situation completely, and then let him decide how he wants to proceed? He could choose to stay under our protection, to return to his people with suitable memory modifications to protect our secrets, or even to serve as some kind of liaison between our peoples if he's willing. Memory modification. Her father's expression was skeptical. You want to potentially erase his memory of you? Of what he did? That seems cruel given his sacrifice. I don't want to. But I want him to have choices. Real choices, not just the ones we decide are acceptable. She leaned forward, trying to convey the intensity of her conviction. Father, this human shattered every expectation I had about his kind. He showed me that compassion can transcend species, that individuals can choose differently than their cultures would demand. If we respond to that by taking away his autonomy, by making decisions for him, for his own good, then we're proving that the divide between our peoples is real and insurmountable. And if he chooses to leave, to return to his people and tell them everything about us, then we deal with those consequences. But Father, we're already in an impossible situation. Every choice we make will have political ramifications. I'd rather face those ramifications knowing we acted with honor than knowing we responded to compassion with control. Her father was quiet for a long time, his fingers steepled in front of his face in a gesture she recognized from childhood. He was thinking, weighing options, running through scenarios and probable outcomes with a kind of analytical precision that had kept House Nightborne stable through countless crises. You've changed, he said finally. 3 weeks ago you left here as my daughter the scholar, content to spend her days buried in ancient texts and avoiding political responsibilities. Now you return as someone willing to take on the most complex diplomatic challenge we've faced in decades. What happened to you in that cave, Seraphine? I learned that some things are worth the risk. That some people are worth fighting for regardless of what it costs. She met his gaze steadily. And I learned that maybe my studies weren't just academic exercises. Maybe understanding the history between our peoples, understanding how we became enemies, matters not just intellectually but practically. Because if we can't find ways to bridge that divide, We're all doomed to keep killing each other forever. Pride flickered across her father's face, quickly suppressed but visible enough that Seraphine caught it. Your mother would have been proud of you. She always believed in the possibility of peace between our kinds, even when I was skeptical. And now I find myself with a daughter blood-bonded to a human and making passionate arguments for cross-species cooperation, which suggests either the world is changing or my family has a genetic predisposition toward impossible idealism. He smiled, and it was genuine this time. Very well, daughter. We'll do this your way. Full honesty with your human. Let him make his own choices about how he wants to proceed. And we'll deal with whatever political fallout results from those choices. Relief flooded through Seraphine with almost physical force. Thank you, Father. Don't thank me yet. This decision may well cause problems that take decades to resolve. But, he paused, his expression growing serious. You're right that some things are worth the risk. And if this human is half as remarkable as you seem to believe, then perhaps he deserves the chance to prove that humans and vampires can be something other than enemies. A knock at the door interrupted whatever response Seraphine might have made. Captain Lissa entered, her expression professionally neutral but with something in her eyes that suggested important news. Your Highness, Lord Nightborn, the medical team has an update on the human's condition. They thought you'd want to know immediately. Seraphine was on her feet before Lissa finished speaking, her heart hammering with sudden anxiety. What is it? Is he? He's stable. The surgery was successful. Dr. Chen says the prognosis has improved significantly. Lissa's expression softened slightly. He's asking for you, Your Highness. He became agitated when he woke and you weren't there. They've sedated him lightly, but he keeps saying your name. The relief was so intense it made Seraphine's knees weak. He was alive. Not just surviving, but well enough to wake, to ask for her, to remember who she was despite the trauma and the surgery. I should go to him. She looked at her father, seeking permission that she technically didn't need but felt important to request anyway. Of course. We can continue this discussion later. He moved toward her, and for a moment protocol fell away entirely as he pulled her into an embrace that was pure father rather than political leader. I'm glad you're safe, daughter. Truly glad. Don't scare me like that again. I'll try not to, she promised, returning the embrace with interest. Though given current circumstances, I'm not sure I can guarantee it. He laughed, releasing her. Go. Be with your human. Make sure he understands that we're here to help, not to harm. And Seraphine, when you tell him who you are, when you see how he reacts, trust your judgment. You've earned that much. She nodded, then followed Captain Lissa out of the conference room and back toward the medical wing. Her mind raced with possibilities, with fears, with hopes she didn't dare examine too closely. Cale was awake, was asking for her, was about to learn truths that might change everything between them. But at least he was alive, and that, for now, was enough. The recovery room was significantly more comfortable than the cave had been. Cale woke slowly this time, not dragged unwillingly toward consciousness by pain, but rising gently through layers of sedation and healing sleep. The first thing he noticed was the absence of agony. The constant screaming of his injured legs had been replaced by a distant, manageable ache that suggested powerful medication and successful medical intervention. The second thing he noticed was the quality of the air, cool, clean, circulating with mechanical precision that spoke of advanced climate control. He wasn't in the cave anymore. Memory returned in fragments. The cave. Seraphine's face above his. The strange sensation of being fed from, intimate and alarming and strangely peaceful all at once. Voices speaking in languages he didn't understand. Movement. Transportation. Snippets of medical procedures glimpsed through fog of anesthesia and pain management. And through it all, one constant, the sense of Seraphine nearby. Not physical presence always, but something else. Some awareness that lived beneath his conscious thoughts, informing him of her emotional state in ways that had no logical explanation. The blood bond. Had to be. She had warned him it would create a connection between them, and apparently she hadn't been exaggerating. He opened his eyes fully and found himself in a room that looked like it belonged in a high-end private hospital. Soft lighting, medical equipment that hummed quietly but efficiently, a large window showing. He blinked and looked again. The window displayed a nighttime cityscape, but something about it seemed off. Too static. Too perfect. A recording, he realized. Or a screen showing a pre-recorded view. Which meant he was probably underground. Which made sense if he was somewhere populated by vampires who preferred to avoid even the possibility of accidental sunlight. You're awake. He turned his head, moving carefully, testing the limits of his mobility, and found Seraphine standing in the doorway. She looked different than she had in the cave. Cleaner, certainly. Someone had provided her with fresh clothes, elegant dark garments that seemed to be made of fabric that cost more than his entire military salary. Her hair had been cleaned and arranged, falling in waves that caught the room's soft light. She looked rested, recovered, and impossibly beautiful in ways that made his chest tight. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. Those gray depths held anxiety, hope, and something that might have been fear. "Hey," he managed, his voice rough from disuse. "Fancy meeting you here." Her laugh was relief and surprise mixed together. "You're joking. You've just undergone extensive surgery, you're in an unknown location surrounded by vampires, and you're making jokes. If I don't joke, I'll probably panic. And panic seems counterproductive given current circumstances." He tried to sit up, found his body didn't entirely cooperate, and settled for raising the head of the bed using the control he found attached to the rail. "How bad is it?" "My legs." "Better than they should be, thanks to some truly exceptional surgeons, both human and vampire, working together." She moved into the room properly, taking the chair beside his bed. They had to place extensive internal hardware to stabilize the fractures. Months of physical therapy ahead, possibly years. But Dr. Chen, your primary surgeon, says you should regain most functionality eventually. Walking, certainly. Running, possibly, depending on how well you heal. That's better than I expected, honestly. He looked down at where his legs were hidden beneath blankets and bandages, trying to process the information. Months of therapy. Hardware in his bones. A new normal that would be defined by limitation and accommodation. I should probably be more upset about that. You're still processing. The emotional impact will likely hit later. Seraphine's voice was gentle. For now, focus on the fact that you're alive. That was far from guaranteed 3 days ago. 3 days. The time frame surprised him. I've been unconscious for 3 days? Mostly. You've had a few brief periods of wakefulness, though I doubt you remember them. The medical team has been keeping you heavily sedated to give your body time to begin healing without the stress of consciousness. She paused, and he saw that anxiety deepen in her eyes. Cale, there are things I need to tell you. Things about where you are, who I am, and what your presence here means. It's going to be complicated. More complicated than waking up in a vampire medical facility after having been fed from and blood bonded to someone I just met. He tried to keep his tone light, but couldn't quite manage it. Seraphine, I think we passed complicated somewhere around the time I threw myself over you to block sunlight. Fair point. She took a breath, and he noticed her hands were trembling slightly where they rested in her lap. Whatever she was about to tell him clearly wasn't easy. When we met, when I told you I was a scholar, I was telling the truth. But I wasn't telling you the whole truth. Okay. He waited, watching her carefully. My full name is Seraphine Nightborn, third daughter of House Nightborn, one of the 7 great vampire houses. She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I'm a princess, Cale. Royal family. Political significance. All the complications that come with that status. The revelation should have shocked him. should have triggered immediate panic or at least serious concern about the implications. But instead, Cale found himself thinking back to those hours in the cave, to the way she had cared for him, to the conversations they had shared. And he realized that her status didn't actually change anything fundamental about who she was or what had passed between them. "So I saved a princess," he said slowly. "That's actually kind of amazing, not going to lie. Wait until I tell my—" He stopped abruptly, reality crashing back. "Can I tell anyone? Am I a prisoner? Is this the part where you explain that I know too much and need to be eliminated for security reasons?" "No." Seraphine leaned forward urgently. "No, nothing like that. You're not a prisoner, Cale. You're under my protection. Blood bond and life debt both. Anyone who harms you would have to answer to me and to House Nightborn. You're probably the safest human in this entire facility." "Okay. Good. That's good." He took a breath, trying to organize his thoughts. "So what does being under your protection mean, exactly? What are my options here?" "That's what I wanted to discuss." She seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "My father, Lord Alexander Nightborn, has agreed that you should have full knowledge of your situation and complete autonomy in deciding how to proceed. You have choices, Cale. Real choices." She laid out the options then, speaking with careful precision. He could stay under vampire protection, recovering in their medical facility and potentially serving as some kind of liaison between species if he was willing. He could return to human society with memory modifications to protect vampire secrets. She assured him these would be careful, surgical removals of sensitive information rather than wholesale erasure of their time together. Or he could choose some middle path, maintaining the blood bond while returning to his people with an agreement to keep vampire secrets in exchange for continued protection and support. Cale listened carefully, appreciating the complexity of what she was offering. Complete honesty. Real choices. The acknowledgement that despite being at what many would consider their mercy, he retained autonomy and agency. "What do you want me to choose?" he asked when she finished. "I want—" She stopped, seeming to reconsider. "I want you to choose whatever feels right to you. Whatever allows you to live the life you want to live. My preferences shouldn't dictate your future." "Seraphine, what do you want?" She was quiet for a long moment, and through their blood bond connection he felt her emotional state shift, anxiety giving way to something more vulnerable, more honest. "I want you to stay," she admitted quietly. "I want you to recover here, to learn about my people without the filter of propaganda and fear. I want—" She took a breath. "I want time. Time to understand this connection between us. Time to see if the person you were in that cave, brave and compassionate and capable of seeing past centuries of hatred, can exist in the wider world. Time to figure out if what started between us as survival necessity might become something else entirely." The honesty of it struck him with almost physical force. No political calculation. No attempt to manipulate. Just simple, vulnerable truth about what she wanted and hoped for. "I barely know you," Cale said slowly. "Beyond those hours in the cave, beyond this blood bond that lets me feel your emotions, I don't know who you are. Your favorite things, your history, what makes you laugh or cry or angry. I don't know if we actually have anything in common beyond shared trauma." "I know." Seraphine's voice was small. "And I understand if—" "But I want to find out," he interrupted gently. "I want to learn those things. Want to understand the person who valued my life enough to refuse feeding even when it cost her. Want to see if the connection we forged in impossible circumstances can survive in the regular world." He paused, then added with a small smile, "Also, I don't have anywhere better to be. My military unit probably thinks I'm dead, I have no family to speak of, and I need months of medical care that your people seem better equipped to provide than anyone else. So yeah, I'll stay. At least for now." The relief and joy that flooded through their bond connection was so intense he almost gasped. Seraphine's face lit up with a smile that transformed her from merely beautiful to absolutely radiant. "Really? You'll stay? Really? though I reserve the right to change my mind if you turn out to have terrible taste in music or something equally deal-breaking." She laughed, the sound free and genuine, and impulsively reached out to take his hand. Her touch was cool, vampire physiology maintaining lower body temperature than humans, but not unpleasant. Comforting, actually. "Thank you," she said simply, "for trusting me, for giving this, whatever this is, a chance to become something. Thank you for not eating me in my sleep, setting the bar pretty high for relationship standards." "Relationship?" She arched an eyebrow. "Presumptuous, aren't you? Blood-bonded, life-debt connected, recovering under the protection of a vampire princess. If that's not the start of some kind of relationship, I don't know what is." He squeezed her hand gently. "Might not be romantic, probably shouldn't be, given the species difference and the complications. But some kind of relationship, yeah. We're bound together now, Seraphine. Might as well make the best of it." "Bound together," she repeated softly, as if testing the phrase. "I think I like that. Not master and servant, not prisoner and captor. Just bound together. Partners, maybe." "Partners works." He felt exhaustion beginning to creep back in, his body demanding rest to continue healing. "I'm going to need to sleep again. This staying conscious thing is harder than it looks. Sleep. Rest. Heal." She stood but didn't release his hand. "I'll be here when you wake. That's a promise, Cale. However long this takes, however complicated things get, I'll be here." "Same," he murmured, already feeling himself slipping towards sleep. "Partners, remember? We face things together now." He drifted off with her hand still in his, with a sense of her presence anchoring him through the blood bond, with the knowledge that whatever came next, political complications, physical recovery, the challenge of building something meaningful across species lines, he wouldn't face it alone. In the doorway, unnoticed by the room's occupants, Lord Alexander Nightborne watched the scene with an expression that mixed concern, hope, and paternal affection. He had witnessed the exchange, had seen the genuine connection between his daughter and this human who had sacrificed so much. It was complicated. It was unprecedented. It was potentially dangerous. But it was also, perhaps, exactly what their divided world needed. He withdrew quietly, leaving them to their rest, and went to begin the difficult work of ensuring that this impossible partnership would have the chance to grow into something that might change history. Behind him, in the recovery room, Seraphine sat beside Cale's bed, maintaining her vigil, already planning the conversations they would have and the future they might build. Together.